I walked into the courtroom and there was Patty. The smell of cigarette smoke around her was fresh. I'm sure she had been chain smoking before she came inside. Her hair and her clothes weren't clean, and she looked at me with this familiar, long, blank stare. Patty was 6 months pregnant. I was wearing a suit that day, and I was self-conscious about it because as I sat down next to Patty on that long wooden bench in the courtroom, the contrast between the two of us was striking. Patty was the defendant. Patty was there defending her right to stay in the public housing apartment where her and her young daughter lived. I was there because I'm in charge of enforcing the rules there. I'm the director of the Housing Authority that owns and operates the apartment complex where Patty had lived with us for the last 12 months. One of the rules that I'm in charge of enforcing is the one about paying the rent on time and every month. And while Patty had lived in the homeless shelter here in the city for about 9 months prior to moving in with us, now in public housing, the amount of rent you pay is based upon the amount of income that you make. And Patty didn't make much of anything, so she didn't need to pay much of anything, but the problem is that she wasn't paying at all. Our resident services staff had tried to follow up and get her back on track. She had signed 2 repayment agreements, one with us and one with the court. She had listened to calls and letters and visits, but all of them went unreturned. And now the eviction notice, and now here we were in court. Now, I know all too well that there are 0 positive outcomes to becoming homeless. So of course we wanted to do whatever we could to prevent that. So we were here early meeting with Patty because what we really needed to know was what her plan was. But what I really wanted to know was what Patty's whole story was. And sadly, but not unexpectedly, Patty's story was similar to those I have heard over and over before. You see, Patty wasn't in an unfamiliar place right then. In fact, she's never known anything else. Because Patty was born into an environment where her young mind was in a constant and overwhelming amount of toxic stress. Patty grew up in a broken family. She had moved from home to home. She had caretakers that were suffering from addiction. She had witnessed violence, and she was the victim of abuse. Patty could actually remember the day, even though she was really young at the time. She remembered the day where her uncle was taken out of her apartment on a stretcher, and all of the screaming and crying and blaming and fighting that took place before and during and after his fatal overdose. Today it was Patty that was struggling with an addiction to prescription drugs. So what I've learned is, after listening carefully to Patty and the stories so many like her, is that Patty's challenges didn't begin last month or last year when some hard luck or a bad decision made the homeless shelter her only choice. Patty's challenges began in the earliest days of her life when she experienced a prolonged amount of toxic stress, the kind of stress that we now know changes the actual anatomy of the human brain. Toxic stress is the physical and emotional response of children to events that threaten the life or the physical integrity of the child or someone close to the child. When the rapidly developing brains of very young children experience prolonged stress, it actually has a physiological response that can distort the brain and nervous system in a way that's similar to infant exposure to lead or mercury or alcohol or other drugs. So the infant mind it's incomplete at birth. It's still adapting to what it senses, to what it sees and hears and and feels. Early learning is a send and receive process. It's where infants and very young children send messages out into the world and then receive other messages back through sound and through language and through touch. And the proper structural growth of the brain requires that this environment is nurturing and loving and stimulating, that there are adults present and engaged. But when the opposite is true, when there's neglect, or where there's violence, or where there's abuse, the damage to the young brain can and will be permanent. So, unlike exposure to toxic substances, which can be confirmed, where symptoms can be confirmed with a blood test, infant exposure to toxic stress is harder to diagnose or explain. But a study by the CDC actually found a clear connection between certain traits and behaviors in adults and what they called adverse childhood experiences. The study actually found that there were several specific indicators, things like physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, neglect, the presence of household violence or mental illness or substance abuse, or even events like parental incarceration or separation or divorce. What the study found is that when there were 6 or more of these indicators, there was a 90% chance of that child experiencing developmental delays. 90%. And when there were 7 or more of these indicators, that was 100%. This means that based upon Patty's childhood, her cognitive abilities were impaired before she ever set foot in school. So was her ability to prioritize. So was her ability to control her own emotions. So was her ability to respond to stress in a healthy way. And tragically, so was her ability to love and be loved. And now she's stuck as an adult, along with millions of other Americans who are like her, who are stuck in this constant state of debilitating scarcity, including many of the estimated 500,000 people who will be homeless in America tonight. So while trauma and toxic stress happen to kids across all economic levels, there's a much higher correlation between adverse childhood experiences and those who are living in poverty. Did you know that even though we're the wealthiest civilization in history, we have a higher child poverty rate than almost all other developing countries? As many as 4 times higher than countries with a similar per capita income. And we live in a country where as many as 1 in 30 children have been homeless in any given year. That's 2.5 million kids in this country. If we were just average, if America were on par with the rest of the industrialized world, there would be 19 million fewer Americans in poverty than there are today. This means that the American dream, the American dream that is such a part of our culture, it's such a part of our national narrative. For kids and families that have suffered from adverse childhood experiences, it's a complete myth. Because more than 60% of the kids that are born into this bottom 1/5 of income earners in the country will never make it to the middle. So there's a much higher correlation between adverse childhood experiences and poverty, and sadly, this is something that perpetuates from generation to generation, and even magnifies from generation to generation. This is because many of the traits and behaviors that adults experience as a result of early childhood trauma are also traits and behaviors that greatly reduce parenting ability. For instance, while she's an adult by age, Patty has almost no ability for what child development experts call executive function, or the ability to put first things first. And Patty has almost no ability to control her own emotions. She has no ability to respond to stress in a healthy, productive way, except by using alcohol or tobacco or other legal or illegal drugs. And let's face it, parenting is stressful for anyone. But for Patty, this means that her kids are at much higher risk for experiencing trauma themselves. So we're sticking with Patty. We're still trying to connect Patty to the social and support networks and the faith-based programs and the agencies that can help her connect to her community and help protect her kids from toxic stress. Because the good news is that adverse childhood experiences only have negative outcomes in the absence of the buffering protection of a supportive adult relationship. Toxic stress or stress in a supported environment may not be toxic at all. We see this all the time too. Whether that person is a neighbor or a grandparent or a volunteer or a coach or a social worker or anybody who that child feels and knows cares about them and will protect them. Because it's clear to me that if we want to be serious about breaking the generational cycle of poverty in this country, we have to be more serious about how our community cares for our very youngest children. Believe me, the worst place to be trying to prevent homelessness was where I was sitting with Patty in that courtroom, broke and medicated and desperate and out of time. But here's what we need to do. The first thing that we can do is for these kids and families, we need to see them. Patty and many other extremely low-income people are an invisible population here in our affluent community. So while we're going to our open houses and signing up our kids at camps and for music lessons and for ski trips, let's try to see the kids that aren't right before our eyes. Let's try to get them engaged, enrolled, and acknowledged as an important part of the community. Be that coach that reaches out to get them to play. Be a friend to a low-income parent who is struggling. The other thing we can do is advocate for more early education and parenting support programs. Home visitation programs, for instance, while they're not widely disseminated, have incredible promise to protect kids from toxic stress because they actually focus on the earliest age, prenatal through the first 2 or 3 years of life. Early childhood education programs are the same, and also paid family leave is a policy that's winning more and more support, but we're still not yet there. The other thing we can do is invest. Do you know that last year we gave a record $43 billion to our colleges and universities in the United States? The problem is that the kids who have really suffered from these adverse childhood experiences, they'll never apply. So if you want your philanthropic dollars to go to higher education, instead invest in programs right here in your community that can help protect high-risk kids from trauma and toxic stress. And the last thing we can all do is love all of these kids like you do your own kids. Patty's kids live right here in our community. They're growing up right alongside our kids. And adverse childhood experiences can be harsh, but this generational poverty can be prevented with the active presence of just one caring adult. So let that caring adult be you, and you'll give these kids the opportunities and the advantages that will last generations for their families too. Thank you.